The sun bleeds out across the horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. In the valley below, a woman stumbles through the mesquite and catclaw, her breath a ragged sob in the cooling air. Her name is Alara, and she is alone, pregnant, and hunted, not by men, not yet, but by the ancient predators of this land. A howl splits the twilight, closer this time, a chilling harmony of hunger and pursuit. Panic, cold and sharp, lances through her exhaustion. She clutches the swell of her belly, a protective gesture that is both desperate and futile. This is not how it was supposed to be. The advertisement promised a new life, a respectable husband in a town called Dusty Creek, a place to finally be safe. Instead, the wagon axle cracked, the driver cursed her for dead weight, and left her with a canteen of water and a dismissive wave. That was 2 days ago. Now, the water is gone, and something else has found her scent. The pack emerges from the gloaming, spectral shapes with eyes like embers. They are patient, circling, their low growls a death rattle in the vast, indifferent wilderness. She sinks to her knees, the fine dust of the desert floor coating her torn dress. This is the end. A final, desperate prayer leaves her lips, a whisper lost to the wind. And then he appears. He doesn't ride in on a white horse or announce himself with a shout. He simply materializes from the shadows of a rock outcropping, a man carved from the very earth he stands upon. He is tall and lean, his skin the color of burnished copper, his black hair long and unbound. He moves with a silence that unnerves her almost as much as the wolves circling. An Apache, every terrible story she had ever heard whispered back east rises in her throat. But his attention is not on her. His gaze, dark and unreadable, is fixed on the pack. He carries no rifle, only a long, finely crafted bow and a quiver of arrows on his back. With a motion too swift to follow, an arrow is knocked. The string sings a low, deadly note, and the lead wolf collapses with a yelp, a feathered shaft protruding from its throat. The others hesitate, their predatory confidence broken. He knocks another arrow, his movements fluid and economical. He does not shout or make a show of aggression. He is simply a lethal presence, a disruption to the natural order of the hunt. The pack, weighing the promise of a meal against the certainty of death, scatters and vanishes back into the twilight. Silence descends once more, broken only by Alara's trembling breaths. The warrior turns his gaze to her, and for the first time, she sees not a savage, but a savior. His expression is unreadable, his eyes holding the vast, lonely emptiness of the land itself. He takes a step toward her, and she flinches, the ingrained fear of his people warring with the gratitude for her life. He stops, his gaze dropping to the undeniable curve of her belly. He says nothing, but a question hangs in the air between them, as stark and silent as the desert stars beginning to prick the velvet sky. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. She's a mail-order bride, or was meant to be, on her way to a man named Silas Croft, a man who owns a general store and, by the sound of his letters, half the town of Dusty Creek. The warrior, who she later learns is named Nakai, doesn't seem to understand or care about the details. He understands survival, and with a single, sharp nod, he makes a decision that will bind their fates together. He will take her from this place of death. But in saving her from the wolves, he is unknowingly leading her toward a man whose cruelty will make the predators of the wilderness seem merciful. The bounty that will be placed on his head is not yet a whisper on the wind, but the hatred that will fuel it is already waiting, festering in the heart of the man she was promised to. He led her not to a camp of whooping fires and dancing figures from the dime novel she'd seen, but to a place of profound stillness. It was a shallow cave, a weathered scoop in the side of the sandstone cliff, hidden by a curtain of ancient, gnarled junipers. The entrance was so well concealed that she would have walked right past it, and she realized with a jolt that he had likely watched her stumbling through the desert for some time before the wolves had made their move. The thought was both unsettling and strangely comforting. Inside, the space was sparse but orderly. A bed of dried grasses and soft rabbit pelts lay in one corner. A small, smokeless fire burned in a pit ringed with stones, its heat a welcome balm against the chill that had seeped into her bones. There were clay pots, a tightly woven water basket, and tools she didn't recognize, all arranged with an air of purpose. This was not a temporary shelter. It was a home, however Spartan. Nakai motioned for her to sit on the furs, his gestures economical and clear. He moved around the cave with a quiet grace that was mesmerizing. He took a small clay pot, filled it with water from the basket, and set it near the fire. From a leather pouch, he took a pinch of dried leaves and crumbled them into the warming water. The air filled with a clean, faintly bitter scent. Alara watched him, her fear slowly being replaced by a deep, weary curiosity. He was nothing like the caricatures she'd been raised to fear. There was no menace in his silence, only a profound self-possession. His face, which she had first seen as a hard mask, showed lines of concentration around his eyes and mouth as he worked. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps not much older than her own 20 years, but he carried himself with the gravity of a man who had seen far more winters. He brought the cup of herbal tea to her, his long fingers careful not to touch hers as he passed it over. She took it with a trembling hand, the warmth seeping into her skin. The tea was bitter but soothing, and it eased the knot of terror in her stomach. He then offered her a piece of jerky. It was tough and smoky, and she had to chew it for a long time, but it was the most substantial food she'd had in days, and it tasted like life itself. They existed in this silence for what felt like hours. He sat on the other side of the fire, sharpening an obsidian arrowhead with a piece of antler, the scrape, scrape, scrape of the work a rhythmic counterpoint to the crackle of the flames. She found herself studying him, the way the firelight caught the high planes of his cheekbones, the focused intensity in his dark eyes. He never stared at her, but she felt his awareness. He was like a hawk, seeing everything without seeming to look. Finally, she had to speak. The silence was a weight, and her story was a burden she needed to set down. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice raspy. He glanced up from his work, his hands stilling. He gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement that he had heard. I was on my way to Dusty Creek." She hesitated, the words feeling foolish in this raw, elemental place. "To be married." He showed no reaction, his face impassive. "To a man named Silas Croft." At this, a flicker of something passed through his eyes. Recognition? Contempt? It was gone before she could be sure. He went back to his work, the scraping sound resuming. His lack of response was more unnerving than an outburst would have been. Dusty Creek and its people were clearly not foreign to him. "My wagon broke down," she continued, needing to fill the void. "The driver, he left me." The shame of it burned her cheeks. She was an inconvenience, a piece of cargo not worth the trouble of transport. Nakai set down his tools. He looked at her directly then, his gaze steady and searching. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw a reflection of her own desolation. He knew what it was to be left behind, to be considered less than human by the world of towns and fences. He rose and walked to the mouth of the cave, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. The landscape that had nearly killed her was his sanctuary. He stood there for a long time, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. When he turned back, he spoke for the first time since she'd met him. His voice was low and rough, as if unused to forming the English words. "Dusty Creek is 2 days' walk," he said, "if you're strong." His eyes drifted again to her belly. The unspoken words hung between them, "and you are not." The next morning, he checked the splint he had fashioned for her swollen ankle, which she'd twisted in her panicked flight. His touch was firm and impersonal, yet gentle. He gave her more jerky and a handful of sweet, dry berries for breakfast. He moved with an unhurried efficiency that spoke of a life lived by the rhythms of the sun and the seasons, not the ticking of a town clock. He was preparing to leave, slinging his bow over his shoulder. Panic flared in Alara's chest. You're not leaving me here. He paused, turning to look at her. A hunt, he said, the single word conveying a simple, undeniable necessity. There was no malice in it, just a statement of fact. Food was not bought from a store. It was tracked, killed, and carried home. He pointed to the water basket and the remaining jerky. Stay. In the cave, it was both a command and a piece of advice. The world outside this hidden sanctuary was not safe for her. He was gone for most of the day. The silence of the cave pressed in on Alara. At first, it was a relief, but as the hours stretched on, it became a canvas for her fears. She thought of the wolves. She thought of Silas Croft, a man she knew only from 3 curt letters, his penmanship severe and spiky. His letters spoke of propriety, of his standing in the community, of the duties she would be expected to perform as his wife. There was no warmth in them, no hint of affection, only transaction. She was to provide him with a home and, presumably, heirs, and in return, he would provide her with a roof and his name. It had seemed a fair, if sterile, exchange when she was a destitute orphan in St. Louis. Out here, under the vast, empty sky, it felt like a different kind of cage. What would Silas think when she finally arrived, not on the stagecoach as planned, but on foot, bedraggled and escorted by an Apache? The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool air of the cave. The world was divided into settlers and savages, and she was about to walk into town on the wrong side of that line. She imagined the looks, the whispers, the scorn of the townswomen, the suspicion of the men. And Silas, she pictured his face, stern and unforgiving, as he looked upon the man who had brought her to him. The town, her supposed haven, began to feel as threatening as the wilderness itself. Nakai returned as the sun began to sink, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He said nothing of his hunt, simply set about skinning and cleaning the animals with practiced ease. He cooked the meat on skewers over the fire, and the smell was agonizingly good. He passed her a portion, and they ate in their now customary silence. As she ate, she realized something profound. In 2 days, Nakai had not once made her feel like a burden. He had tended to her, fed her, and sheltered her without a word of complaint or expectation. He had treated her with a quiet, abiding dignity that she had rarely known. He had simply seen a person in need and had acted. She looked at him across the flickering flames, this silent man whom her world had taught her to fear and despise, and she felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He was her protector, her keeper, and she was utterly, terrifyingly in his debt. He was taking her to her future, but she was beginning to fear she was leaving her only true sanctuary behind. The journey to Dusty Creek was a slow, arduous pilgrimage. Nakai shortened her splint and found her a sturdy branch to use as a crutch, but her progress was halting. The land was unforgiving, a tapestry of rock-strewn hills, thorny scrub, and dry, cracked earth that shimmered under the relentless sun. Nakai moved through it with the ease of a creature born to it, his moccasined feet making barely a sound. He was endlessly patient with her, never rushing her, always stopping when he saw her breath grow too ragged or her face pale with exhaustion. He walked ahead, a silent scout, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. He seemed to know every dip in the land, every animal track, every whisper of the wind. He found water in places that looked utterly barren to her, digging into the damp sand of a dry riverbed until a small pool seeped through. He pointed out plants, naming them in his own tongue first, then in English. Mesquite, he'd say, showing her the beans in their long pods. Edible, in lean times, or he'd touch the vicious spines of a cholla cactus. Do not touch. The needles jump. During these brief lessons, the gulf between them would shrink. She saw not just a warrior, but a man deeply connected to his world, a scholar of the earth. She, in turn, began to feel less like a helpless burden and more like a student. She learned to watch where she placed her feet, to conserve her energy, to read the subtle signs of the landscape. One afternoon, they came to a river, wider and swifter than she'd expected. It wasn't deep, but the current was strong, churning over a bed of smooth, slippery rocks. There was no bridge, no easy crossing. Alara's heart sank. In her condition, she knew she could never make it across on her own. "I cannot," she said, her voice small. Nakai studied the water for a long moment, his gaze tracking the flow of the current. He looked at her exhausted frame and the crutch she leaned on, and then back at the water. He gave a short, decisive nod. He walked into the river, the cold water swirling around his leggings. He tested his footing, moving slowly and deliberately until he was halfway across. Then he turned and came back. "I will carry you," he said. It was not a question. Fear and a strange, unexpected flutter of something else went through her. To be held by him, to put her life so completely in his hands, it was a level of intimacy she had not anticipated. But there was no alternative. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He put his bow and quiver on a high, dry rock. He came to her and, with a surprising lack of ceremony, bent down. "Hold on," he instructed. She put her arms around his neck, her cheek pressing against the hard muscle of his shoulder. He smelled of sun, dust, and something wild and clean like pine needles. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The strength in his arms was astonishing. He started into the river. The water was shockingly cold, and she gasped, clinging to him tighter. The current tugged at them, and for one terrifying moment, his foot slipped on a slick rock. He grunted with effort, his muscles tensing like coiled ropes as he found his balance again. She could feel the strain in him, the sheer power he was exerting to keep them both upright and moving forward against the relentless push of the water. In that moment, her fear of him, the last lingering vestiges of the prejudice she'd been taught, washed away down the river. He was not Apache, she was not white. They were simply two people, one strong and one weak, fighting a river together. His survival was her survival. When they reached the other side, he set her down gently on a sun-warmed patch of sand. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the shared ordeal hanging in the air between them. A connection had been forged in that crossing, a bond of pure, physical trust that transcended words. He had held her life and the life of her child in his arms, and he had not failed. He retrieved his bow, and they continued on, the silence between them now comfortable, layered with a new, unspoken understanding. She noticed he walked a little closer to her now, his presence a steady shield against the harshness of the land. That evening, as they made camp, he surprised her. After they had eaten, he took a small, intricately carved wooden flute from his pack. He sat by the fire and began to play. The music was like nothing she had ever heard. It was a lonely, haunting melody that seemed to speak of wide-open spaces, of loss, and of a beauty so fierce it was almost painful. It was the sound of his soul, she thought, and it filled the vast emptiness of the night. She listened, her eyes closed, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. She was a lost, pregnant mail-order bride, and her protector was a man her society called savage. But as the last notes of his flute faded into the chirping of the crickets, she knew she was safer with him than she was ever likely to be in the town of Dusty Creek. The thought of Silas Croft, her intended, was a cold stone in her gut. She was walking towards her future, but every step felt like a betrayal of the man who had truly saved her. They saw the first signs of Dusty Creek the next afternoon. A distant plume of smoke from a chimney, the faint, geometric lines of fences carving up the landscape. Nakai grew tense, his easy silence replaced by a watchful stillness. He led them into a thicket of cottonwoods that bordered a shallow creek, a place where they could observe without being seen. "I will go," he said, his voice low. "See the town. You will wait here." "No," Alara said, the word surprising them both. "I'll go. It's me they're expecting." She couldn't bear the thought of him walking into that town alone. She had seen the way a lone prospector they had passed on the trail had looked at Nakai, his hand instinctively going to the pistol on his hip, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and hate. Nakai's jaw tightened. "They will not welcome you with me, and they will not welcome you at all," she countered. "Let me go to the general store. Let me speak to Mr. Croft. I will tell him what happened. I will tell him you saved me." She tried to inject a confidence she did not feel in her voice. She would make Silas understand. He had to. He was a businessman, a pillar of the community. Surely he would be grateful. Surely he would reward Nakai for his decency. He studied her face for a long time, his dark eyes searching for the truth of her resolve. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Stay away from the saloon. Go to the store. If there is trouble, I will hear it." He gestured to the trees. "I will be close." Alara cleaned herself as best she could in the creek, smoothing her wrinkled dress and trying to tame her wild hair. She looked a fright, a scarecrow of a woman, but there was nothing to be done for it. Leaning on her crutch, she left the shelter of the cottonwoods and began the final walk into Dusty Creek. The town was a single dusty street flanked by a dozen or so grim, false-fronted buildings. A saloon, a blacksmith, a livery, a small church, and at the very center, the largest and most imposing building of all, Croft's Mercantile and Emporium. People stopped and stared as she limped down the street. Women whispered behind their hands, their eyes taking in her torn dress, her swollen belly, her wild appearance. Men tipped their hats with smirks on their faces. The air of judgment was thick enough to choke on. This was the sanctuary she had traveled 1,000 miles for. She pushed open the door to the Mercantile. A bell jingled. The store was dim and cool, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and oiled wood. Behind the long counter stood a man who matched the severe tone of his letters perfectly. Silas Croft was tall and thin, with a narrow face, pale eyes, and a mouth that looked as if it had never known a smile. He was dressed in a starched shirt and a dark vest, the very picture of grim respectability. He looked up, his expression one of mild annoyance at being disturbed. Then his eyes fell on her, and his face hardened. He took in her appearance with a slow, contemptuous sweep of his gaze. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cold and flat. "Mr. Croft?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I am Alara. Alara Vance." Recognition dawned in his pale eyes, followed swiftly by a wave of pure, undiluted fury. He came around the counter, his movements stiff with rage. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His venom was a quiet, chilling thing. "You," he hissed, his eyes flicking to the street outside, as if to ensure no one was watching. "Look at the state of you. Where have you been? The stage was due 3 days ago. My wagon, it broke down. I was stranded. You were stranded," he repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. "And where did you acquire that?" He gestured vaguely at her belly, as if it were a contagion she had brought into his pristine store. "It is your child, Mr. Croft," she said, her cheeks flaming. "As I wrote to you in my letter." His face went pale, then a blotchy red. "Do not speak of such things here," he spat. "You arrive looking like a harlot, dragged in from the desert. And you expect me to claim you? To claim at?" It was then that the door opened again. A man, a grimy-looking trapper with a rifle in his hand, swaggered in. "Silas," he said, grinning, "saw the little stray wander in. I also saw who brought her to the edge of town. Had himself an Apache guide." Silas Croft's head snapped up, his pale eyes fixed on the trapper, then swung back to Alara, a new and terrible understanding dawning on his face. The disgust morphed into something far more dangerous, a righteous, possessive fury. An Apache? Silas's voice was dangerously soft now. She was with an Apache. "Yep," the trapper said, enjoying himself. "Saw him skulking in the cottonwoods down by the creek. A lone brave. Easy pickings." Silas looked at Alara, but he wasn't seeing her anymore. He was seeing his property sullied, his reputation threatened. He saw an opportunity to turn his personal humiliation into a display of civic power. He walked back behind his counter and pulled out a heavy ledger book, slamming it down. He opened it, took up a pen, and wrote with sharp, angry strokes. And he tore the page out. He strode to the door and nailed it to the wooden post outside for all to see. Alara limped after him, her heart pounding with a dreadful premonition. She read the words he had written, the ink still wet. Bounty, $100 in gold, for the capture or killing of the Apache brave. Wanted for the abduction and defilement of my intended bride. The world tilted on its axis. A wave of nausea and disbelief washed over her. No, she whispered. No, you don't understand. He saved me. He saved our child from wolves. Silas turned to her, his face a mask of cold triumph. My bride was abducted by a savage, he announced to the small crowd that was already gathering, drawn by the commotion. He has been tracking her, holding her captive for days. Now he skulks at the edge of my town, waiting to reclaim what he believes is his. This town will not stand for it. This is a matter of honor. The trapper let out a whoop. $100. Boys, let's go earn us some gold. Men poured out of the saloon, their faces alight with greed and a sanctioned hatred. They checked their pistols, grabbed their rifles. The hunt was on. Alara stared at Silas, horrified. This was her intended husband, this man of honor. He had not asked if she was hurt. He had not asked if she was hungry. He had seen only his own shame and had decided to wash it away with the blood of an innocent man. You are a monster, she breathed. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in her flesh like talons. You are my property now, he snarled, his voice low enough for only her to hear. You will go to my house, you will keep your mouth shut, and you will learn your place. And you will watch as we bring justice to the animal that touched you. He shoved her toward the small, neat house next to the store. From the window of that house, her new prison, she watched the posse form. They were a mob, drunk on righteousness and the promise of gold. They thundered out of town on horseback, heading directly for the cottonwoods by the creek. Heading for Nakai. She had led him here. She had walked him into a trap laid by the vilest kind of predator, a civilized man. Her heart shattered. She had brought death to the one person who had shown her life. The world shrank to the four walls of Silas Croft's house. He had locked her in the spare room, a small, suffocating space with a single barred window and a cot. It was a cell, plain and simple. From outside, she could hear the sounds of the town, the normal comings and goings, but they sounded distant, as if from another world. Her world was this room, and the agonizing, ticking silence of waiting. She paced the floor, her mind a maelstrom of fear and self-loathing. She pictured the posse, their faces twisted with greed, hunting Nakai through the land he knew so well. But they were many, and he was one. They had rifles. He had a bow. The image of him falling, pierced by their bullets, played over and over in her head until she felt she would go mad. She had been so naive, so foolishly optimistic, to believe that truth and gratitude could stand against the tide of prejudice. She had handed Nakai's life to Silas on a silver platter. Hours bled into one another. Dusk fell, painting the patch of sky visible through her window a bruised purple. A woman from the church, a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Gable, brought her a tray with a bowl of thin stew and a slice of bread. The woman wouldn't meet her eyes. Mr. Croft says you are to eat and rest, she said, her tone implying that Alara was a source of great shame and inconvenience to them all. You've had a terrible ordeal. My ordeal is just beginning, Alara whispered, but the woman was already gone, locking the door behind her. The stew sat untouched. How could she eat while Nakai was being hunted? The baby kicked inside her a small, insistent flutter. It was a reminder of the other life intertwined with hers. The life Nakai had saved not once, but twice. First from the wolves, and then from the river. He had carried them both. The weight of that debt was crushing. Later that night, she heard the posse return. There were no triumphant shouts, only the tired clop of hooves and the low, angry muttering of men. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. Like a ghost, one man was saying. Tracks just disappear on bare rock. It's unnatural. He doubled back on us twice, said another voice, filled with grudging respect. Made us look like fools chasing our own tails. Silas's voice cut through the others, sharp and commanding. He's still out there. The bounty stands. Double it. $200 for the man who brings me his scalp. A cheer went up, but it sounded thinner this time, tinged with the frustration of a failed hunt. Alara sank onto the cot, a sliver of desperate hope piercing through her despair. He was alive. He had outsmarted them. Nakai was not a fool to be cornered in a thicket. He was a creature of the wilderness, and they were clumsy, loud intruders in his domain. The next few days were a blur of confinement and fear. Silas kept her locked away, a shameful secret to be dealt with after his honor was satisfied. He visited her only once, his face a thundercloud. "You will tell everyone who asks that he forced you," Silas commanded, standing over her. "You will weep and tell them of your terror. You will make them understand the violation. Is that clear?" Alara looked up at him, at his cold, merciless eyes, and for the first time since arriving, she felt no fear of him, only a profound, bottomless contempt. "He was more of a man in his silence than you will ever be with all your words," she said, her voice steady. His hand flew, and the crack of it across her face echoed in the small room. The sting was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the pain in her soul. "You will learn respect," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You belong to me now. Your thoughts, your words, your body. All of it." He left, locking the door. She touched her cheek, the skin already swelling. The blow had not broken her. It had forged her. It had burned away the last of the timid, hopeful girl who had stepped off the stagecoach line. In her place was a woman who had seen true honor and true evil and knew, without a doubt, which was which. She had to escape, not just for herself, but for Nakai. She was the only one who could clear his name. Her word against Silas's. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one they had. She began to plan, her mind working with a clarity born of desperation. She studied the room, the barred window, the simple lock on the door. She ate the food Mrs. Gable brought, forcing it down to keep up her strength for her and for the baby. She pretended to be cowed, her eyes downcast whenever the woman appeared, playing the part of the broken victim Silas wanted her to be. The nights were the worst. She would lie on a cot, listening to the sounds of the bounty hunters riding out at dawn and returning at dusk, always empty-handed, their frustration growing with each passing day. They were combing the hills, setting traps, becoming more reckless. It was only a matter of time. One evening, as she lay there, she heard a sound so faint she thought she'd imagined it. A soft, scraping noise at her window. Her heart leaped in her throat. She crept to the window and peered through the bars. In the deep shadows below, a figure was pressed against the wall of the house. It was not Kai. Her breath caught in a sob of relief. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes dark and urgent in the moonlight. He had come back for her. He had risked walking into the heart of the town that wanted him dead, right under the nose of the man who had offered a bounty for his life. He held up a long, thin piece of metal. He had been working on the window, prying at the rusted iron casing that held the bars in place. It was a slow, painstaking process. He worked for what felt like an hour, the soft scrape and groan of the metal an agonizingly loud noise in the quiet night. Finally, with a low creak, one side of the bar frame came loose. He was able to bend it just enough for her to squeeze through. He gestured for her to come. There was no time for hesitation. She gathered the small bundle she had made, a piece of bread and a small flask of water she'd saved, and pushed it through the gap. Then, with a grunt of effort, she squeezed her own body through the narrow opening, scraping her arms and side. He caught her as she dropped to the ground, his hands steadying her. For a moment, they just stood there in the shadows, her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. No words were needed. His presence was an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to voice. "They will look for you in my home," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "We cannot go there." "Where then?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A place they do not know. A place of the old ones." He led her away from the house, moving through the back alleys and shadows of Dusty Creek like a phantom. Every dog that barked, every light that flickered in a window, sent a jolt of fear through her. But Nakai was calm, a steady presence beside her. He was taking her away from her prison, away from Silas. But she knew this was not the end. Running would not solve this. As long as that bounty existed, as long as Silas's lie stood as truth, Nakai would never be safe. He could not run forever. They holed up in a series of ancient cliff dwellings, small homes carved into the face of a sheer canyon wall centuries ago by a people long vanished. It was a sacred, hidden place, accessible only by a series of treacherous hand and footholds that Nakai navigated with ease. From their high perch, they could see for miles, watching for any sign of pursuit. The days that followed were a strange mixture of terror and tranquility. The constant fear of discovery was a sharp edge under every moment. Yet in the quiet solitude of the canyon, their bond deepened. They were no longer rescuer and victim, but partners in a desperate struggle for survival. She learned the rhythm of his life. He would leave at dawn to hunt or scout, returning with food or news. He taught her how to weave a sturdy basket from yucca fibers, how to find edible roots, how to start a fire with a fire drill. His hands, which she once thought were only for weapons, were skilled at creation as well. In the evenings, they would talk. She told him of her life in St. Louis, of the orphanage, of the suffocating poverty that had driven her to answer Silas Croft's advertisement. She spoke of her hopes for a family, for a place to belong, a hope that now felt like a bitter joke. He, in turn, told her of his people. He did not speak of battles or raids, but of stories, of traditions, of a way of life that was being squeezed into oblivion by the relentless tide of men like Silas Croft. He was a Chiricahua, one of the few who had not been forced onto the reservation at San Carlos. He lived alone, a ghost in his own land, clinging to the old ways. "My father taught me this place," he said one evening, his voice soft as he looked out over the vast expanse of the canyon. He said the spirits of our grandfathers watch from these walls. He said as long as one of us remembers, they are not truly gone. Alara listened, and she understood that his fight was not just for his own life, but for the memory of his entire people. He was a living testament to their endurance, and Silas Croft wanted to erase him, to turn him into another forgotten savage, a footnote in the story of the town's triumph. One afternoon, he returned from a scouting trip, his face grim. "They're using dogs," he said. "They will find this place. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after." The fragile peace of their sanctuary shattered. Panic seized Alara. "Then we must run again. We can go north into the mountains." "There is no north that is far enough," he interrupted, his voice flat with a terrible finality. "As long as the bounty stands, we will be hunted. Silas Croft will not stop. A man like that cannot let a challenge to his honor go unanswered." "So what do we do?" she cried, despair welling up inside her. "We cannot fight them all." "No," he said, his eyes meeting hers. He was looking at her, but also through her, as if weighing the fate of the world. "We cannot fight them all. We must fight one, the one who told the lie." Alara stared at him, her blood running cold. "You want to go back? Back to Dusty Creek? They'll kill you on sight." "They will try," he said with a chilling calm. "But a lie is like a desert weed. If you do not pull it out by the root, it will always grow back. The root is Silas Croft." He was right. She knew he was right. They could spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, or they could face the source of the poison. But the thought of him walking back into that town was unbearable. "He will not listen to you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You are an Apache. Your word means nothing to them." "My word means nothing," he agreed. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "But your word, you are one of them. You are the woman he claims I abducted. You are the victim." The weight of his words settled on her. He wasn't just planning to confront Silas. He was planning for her to confront Silas. The shy, frightened girl who had stumbled into town was gone. The cowed woman Silas had beaten was gone. He was asking the woman who sat before him now, the woman he had shown how to survive, to stand up and speak the truth, no matter the cost. It was a terrifying prospect, to stand before the whole town, a pregnant, unmarried woman, and accuse its most powerful citizen of being a liar and a coward. They would call her a whore, an Indian lover. They might even turn on her. She looked at Nakai, at his proud, resolute face. He had risked everything for her, a stranger. He had saved her, protected her, and treated her with more honor than her own people ever had. He was asking her now to be as brave as he was. The baby kicked within her, a tiny, insistent pulse of life. Nakai's child, in spirit if not in blood. He had saved them both, and she would not let his sacrifice be in vain. She rose to her feet, her spine straight, her chin high. "All right," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We go back, but we do it my way." A plan began to form in her mind, a desperate gamble built on a foundation of truth. They would not sneak into town like thieves in the night. They would walk in at high noon, when the street was full. They would force a confrontation not in the shadows, but in the harsh, revealing light of the sun. It was a choice between a life of running and a single moment of defiant truth. And as she looked at the quiet warrior who stood before her, she knew it was the only choice they had. They walked out of the canyon the next morning as the sun crested the eastern mountains, bathing the world in a clean, golden light. It felt like walking out of a dream and into a firing line. Nakai was dressed as he always was, in simple buckskins, his bow slung over his back. He was calm, his face an unreadable mask, but Alara could feel the tension coiled in him. She walked beside him, her head held high, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. It was her shield and her testimony. Their arrival in Dusty Creek was a spectacle. A child playing in the street saw them first and ran, screaming, "The Apache's back. He's got the woman." Doors slammed shut. Windows opened, faces peering out. Within moments, the street that had been bustling was eerily silent, filled with 100 watching eyes. Men began to emerge from the saloon and the mercantile, rifles in hand. They formed a loose, menacing semicircle, blocking the path forward. The trapper who had first raised the alarm was at the front, his grin predatory. Well, he drawled. "Look what the cat dragged in. Got tired of running. Did you, brave? Come to collect your own bounty." Nakai didn't respond. He simply stopped, his presence a silent challenge. Alara stepped forward slightly, placing herself partially in front of him. "We are not here for trouble," she said, her voice ringing out in the stillness, clearer and louder than she'd expected. "We are here to speak with Silas Croft." The door of the mercantile opened, and Silas himself stepped out onto the boardwalk. He was dressed immaculately, as always, but his face was pale with rage. He saw Nakai, and he saw Alara standing with him, not as a captive but as an ally. The sight was an unbearable affront to his authority. "Seize him," Silas commanded, pointing a trembling finger at Nakai. "He is a wanted man. $200 to the man who puts him down." The bounty hunters raised their rifles. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment. "No," she shouted, her voice filled with a desperate power she didn't know she possessed. She moved to stand directly in front of Nakai, her arms spread wide, a human shield. "You will not shoot this man. You will listen." The men hesitated, their rifles still aimed, but their trigger fingers uncertain. To shoot the Apache, they would have to shoot through the pregnant white woman he had supposedly abducted. It was a complication none of them had bargained for. "She's bewitched by him," Silas screamed, his composure cracking. "He's filled her head with lies. She doesn't know what she's saying." "I know exactly what I am saying, Silas," Alara said, her eyes locking with his across the dusty street. "And it is you who is the liar." A collective gasp went through the crowd. To accuse Silas Croft, the town's patriarch, of lying was blasphemy. "I am the one who was left to die in the desert," she called out, her voice resonating with the force of absolute truth. "I'm the one who was surrounded by wolves, who was about to be torn apart. And this man," she gestured behind her to Nakai, "this savage you want to murder, is the one who saved me. He fought off the wolves. He tended my injuries. He gave me food and water and shelter. He brought me here to the man I was supposed to marry, believing he was bringing me to safety." She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Silas's face. "But he did not bring me to safety. He brought me to a man who saw not a survivor, but a shame. A man who did not ask if I was well, but only how my arrival would look to his neighbors. A man so twisted by his own petty hatred and pride that he offered gold for the murder of the man who saved the life of his own child. She placed a hand on her belly. The gesture was a powerful accusation. The crowd was silent now, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning doubt. They looked from the furious, sputtering Silas to the defiant, pregnant woman and the stoic Apache standing behind her. The simple narrative of the brave townsfolk versus the evil savage was beginning to crumble. "This man," Silas sputtered, pointing at Nakai, "is a worthless redskin. He laid his hands on what was mine. He laid his hands on me to carry me across a river when I was too weak to walk." Alara shot back, her voice ringing with scorn. "He touched me with more honor and respect than you have ever shown me, Silas. You beat me and locked me in a room because I would not repeat your disgusting lies. Is that your honor? Is that the action of a respectable man?" She turned to the crowd, to the women peering from the windows, to the men holding their rifles. "Look at him. Look at the hero of Dusty Creek. So brave, he sent a mob to do his killing for him. So honorable, he puts a price on the head of a man who showed him a mercy he did not deserve." The trapper lowered his rifle slightly. Others did the same. They were looking at Silas now, and for the first time, they were seeing the cracks in his veneer of respectability. They saw the frantic, cornered look in his eyes. Silas, seeing his authority dissolving before his eyes, became unhinged. He pulled a small pistol from his vest pocket. "She is a liar, a filthy Indian lover," he shrieked, and aimed the pistol, not at Nakai, but at Alara. "If I cannot have my honor, I will erase my shame." It happened in a heartbeat. Before Silas could fire, before anyone could react, an arrow appeared in his shoulder. It didn't kill him, but the impact spun him around, causing him to cry out in pain and drop the pistol. It clattered onto the boardwalk. Nakai had not moved, had not appeared to do anything, yet his bow was in his hand, its strings still vibrating. He had saved her life again, with a precision that was both terrifying and magnificent. Silas clutched at his shoulder, his face a mask of shock and pain, the blood seeping through his starched white shirt. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a whimpering fear. The image of the town patriarch, brought low by the very man he had tried to have killed, was a potent one. No one moved. The bounty was forgotten. The lie was exposed, shattered in the middle of the street for all to see. Nakai lowered his bow. He looked at Silas, not with triumph, but with a quiet, profound contempt. Then his eyes met Alara's. In them, she saw a deep, unwavering respect. She had stood her ground. She had spoken the truth. She had become a warrior in her own right. The town doctor pushed through the silent crowd and knelt by the whimpering Silas. No one else offered to help. The posse began to disperse, the men shuffling away, unable to meet Alara's eyes, their faces etched with the shame of their own gullibility and greed. The power of Silas Croft in Dusty Creek was broken, bleeding out into the dust along with his pride. The threat was over. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, a stillness settled over Dusty Creek. The air, once thick with tension and bloodlust, now held only the weight of a truth revealed. Silas Croft was carried into the doctor's office, his moans the only sound breaking the silence. No one looked at Nakai and Alara with open hostility anymore. They looked at them with a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, grudging respect. They had misjudged, and they knew it. Nakai walked to where Silas's pistol lay on the boardwalk. He did not pick it up. He nudged it with the toe of his moccasin, sending it spinning into the dust of the street, an object of contempt. Then he turned to Alara. Without a word, he offered her his hand. She took it. His skin was warm and calloused, his grip firm and steady. It was the first time they had touched not out of necessity, but out of choice. It was a simple gesture, but it felt as binding as any vow spoken before a preacher. It was an acknowledgement of all they had endured, and a promise of all they would face together. They turned their backs on the town of Dusty Creek, on the silent, watching faces and the wreckage of Silas Croft's lies. They walked away, not as fugitives, but as free people who had claimed their own justice. They walked past the cottonwoods where he had waited, past the place where the wolves had circled, and back into the vast, open land that was his home. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows behind them, they paused on a low rise overlooking the valley. The town was just a small smudge in the distance, already fading into the landscape. Nakai retrieved the water skin from his pack and passed it to her. She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her dry throat. She looked at him, at the man who had been a phantom, a savior, a hunted animal, and was now simply her partner. His face was calm in the evening light, the hard lines softened. He was watching the horizon, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where the spirits of his grandfathers kept their watch. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice soft. He turned his gaze from the mountains to her, and for the first time, she saw the hint of a smile touch the corners of his mouth. It transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Home," he said. The word was simple, but it held the promise of everything she had ever wanted: safety, belonging, a future. It was not a place defined by walls or a street or a name on a map. It was a place they would make together, built on a foundation of courage and a truth spoken aloud in the face of hatred. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a quiet anchor in the vast wilderness. He covered her hand with his own. They stood there for a long moment as the first stars appeared, two solitary figures against the immense and beautiful landscape, their journey just beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.